Hello, my name is Theo Wiederkehr, and I'd like to talk to you today about growing dry legumes in the garden. So many of you may be new to growing dry legumes. There are a couple of reasons why I would suggest that you might enjoy learning about this and starting to do it yourself. One is that dry legumes are nutritious, they're delicious, many of us enjoy eating them. They're also very high in protein, and so they're a useful addition to our diets. Another is that they're quite beneficial if you're a gardener in your garden. Dry legumes are members of the family Fabaceae, and all the plants in Fabaceae partner with naturally occurring bacteria in the soil, rhizobia bacteria, to fix nitrogen from the air into the soil, which enriches it for all of the plants which come after them. And so they're really valuable additions to your rotation in your garden. Another reason to grow them is just that there is a tremendous diversity of colors and shapes. A few different possibilities are on the wall of jars behind me. And you will not see many of these in the store, and so really the only way to get these possibilities into your diet is through growing them yourself. Now I should probably mention that this is at the center of my work. I run a small seed company called Carrick Seeds, and we focus on staple crops for gardeners, both dry legumes and grains. And staples are an interesting area because they form the carbohydrate center and protein center of our diets. They're most of what we eat, and yet most gardeners don't grow them at all. When I grew up, my family would grow green beans and shelling peas as our legumes, but we never grew dry peas. And we both ate those fresh and stored them for the winter by canning or freezing, but we didn't think about how we would store our staple crops much. This is a real challenge for many of us as we think about local food systems and more sustainable agriculture, because our staples are often left out of our gardening. And so I think it's really important to bring those crops in. They're fortunately quite easy to start bringing into our gardens because we're already familiar with growing some of them. Many of them are hardy plants which are easy to grow, and so they're relatively simple to bring in. And on the storage end, many of them store easily. That's why they're staples. I am used to all of the labor of freezing and canning when putting away food, but staples are, as a contrast to that, delightfully easy to store. Often things like dry beans, all you do is get them dry and then they will store for months and months. It's far easier than freezing or canning. So if you're going to put dry legumes in your garden, it's helpful to plan a little before you plant. So I think the place to start is to consider, what are your goals in growing dry legumes? Are you looking mostly on the culinary end for something with a particular taste or texture or ease of cooking? Are you looking for something more which fits your climate? And what effort are you willing to put into growing it? So let's explore those goals a little more. In the kitchen there are a couple of considerations. Different dry legumes have widely varying tastes and textures, and so you may already have something that you're particularly interested in. In that case, that's a place to focus when you're choosing a legume. Other people may be interested in something that's new, something that's completely different from anything that they've eaten before, and so you may want to look for novelty. It's also worth considering how much time they take to cook. Generally, the smaller seeded the legume, the faster it is to cook. For example, lentils cook quite quickly and often don't require soaking, unlike some larger seeded legumes. Favas are new to many people, and so they're an interesting and different food which you might enjoy adding into your diet. There are also differences, even within common beans, between how you use them or what they're best suited for. Our family sort of divides our beans into buttery beans, which have a smoother texture, which we like if we're mashing them, say for refried beans, and mealy beans, which have a bit more of a grainy texture. They're often larger seeded, and we prefer them in soups or casseroles. We also have some beans we call utility beans, which work for everything. With peas, we divide them into two groups. There are regular round green peas or yellow peas, which taste similar to what you're used to if you enjoy split peas already. There are also grape peas, which have larger, chunkier seeds, and they have purple or pink flowers. This is a distinctive feature in the garden, so if you find varieties where they mention the flower color, that's a marker of a grape pea. In the kitchen, grape peas taste a bit more like a chickpea than you're probably used to with a pea, so if you're looking for something that's sort of like a cross between a chickpea and a pea in flavor, a grape pea is the way to go. It's also worth considering where you garden. Is area a concern for you, or do you have lots of space? For many gardeners, I think a reason why dry legumes are not in their gardens is that they think it would take too much space to grow a significant quantity. And that's why I think dry legumes are a particularly good spot to start as you think about staple gardening. With some of them, it's quite possible to grow a significant quantity in a relatively small area. However, to do so, you need to know a bit about how they yield and which factors are needing consideration as you choose something for higher yield. Generally, some species will yield higher than others. For example, I find that most common beans will yield more than most peas on a per square foot basis. Within a species, there's also a variation in yield, which is partly dependent on growth habit and partly dependent on season length. Generally, the longer season a variety is, the higher yielding it is, which is a trade-off in our climate where if you choose something too long season, it may be caught by the frost before it's able to mature. But if you push as long season as you can, you also get the highest yield that you can. So that's worth considering. Generally, I've found with common beans particularly that there doesn't seem to be a connection between seed size and yield. Generally, a smaller seeded variety can yield as much as a larger seeded variety. It will just produce more pods to do so. So when you're picking, that can be an issue, because you'll have to pick far more pods of a small seeded variety. But on the other hand, it will probably be faster to cook, so if that's important to you, that needs to be balanced out. Also, you need to consider how much effort and time you have to put into growing your dry legumes. Most dry legumes don't require any watering in my climate. I just plant them and leave them. That's a real advantage over many vegetables. However, some of them will require some more tending than that. Favas particularly will need some watering if you want them to yield as much as they can. Trellising is also an important consideration, and this is where I think it's really important to get into the distinction between bush and vine forms of legumes. A number of different legume species, cowpeas, runner beans, common beans, peas, all come in vining forms and bush forms. The vining forms are what we call indeterminate, so they begin flowering near the bottom and keep flowering, producing more pods and maturing them as the plant grows taller and taller. They tend to need some support, and so a trellis is necessary in some form. The bush varieties tend to be more determinate. They produce a bunch of flowers all at once, and the whole plant dries and matures together. This can make harvesting easier. However, trellised varieties tend to yield more than bush varieties simply because they're taller, and so they make a better use of each square foot of garden space. So if you have a limited square footage, I would strongly recommend pole varieties. Also, it's a question of what sort of work you want to be doing during your season. I generally find that it's easier to build trellises and then not have to crawl around on the ground to harvest, and so I favor vine varieties over bush varieties for that reason. With trellising, there are a few considerations to think about before you begin building. Some legumes need a very small diameter thing to hang on to. Peas particularly need something like a string or a wire. They can't wrap around a big pole to cling to it. Common beans, runner beans, and cowpeas, on the other hand, can easily wrap around something up to maybe 2 or 3 inches in diameter, or something as thin as a string, and so they're much more adaptable with their trellises. When I build trellises, I currently set them up as a tripod at each end of the bed, and then I connect the 2 tripods with a ridge pole, and I put X's of poles which brace the ridge pole at intervals of about 6 or 8 feet along its length. Then in between that, I set up strings or poles to support the plants, which are planted in double rows down each side of the bed. Spacing varies depending on species and variety. As you near your planting time, there are a few things to prepare. First of all, you need to prepare your site. I like to build my trellises, if it's a pole variety, before I plant seeds, and so you need to be ready a couple of weeks in advance of your planting date. I've just found it much easier if I put in the poles without having to avoid seedlings or planted seeds which haven't yet come up. So I tend to do that first and then work my soil. You then need to prepare a seed bed. To do this, it's most important to consider seed to soil contact. For the seed to germinate well, it needs to imbibe water relatively quickly. That is, it needs to drink up water from the soil around the seed, which it can only do if the seed is touching a lot of soil. And so the seed has to have a seed bed which is of a similar consistency to its size. This means that larger seeds can work in rougher seed beds, but smaller seeds need finer seed beds. Favas, for example, can be planted in quite rough soil, whereas lentils need quite a fine seed bed. Beans and peas are in between, but can take fairly rough soil. Then there's the question of when to plant your seeds, and for this it's important to recognize a basic distinction in the legumes. Some of them are quite cold hardy, and some of them need warmth to grow. All of them need a certain amount of warmth and water for them to germinate and grow quickly after they're planted, or the seeds can rot in the soil. The cold hardy legumes, which would include peas, favas, lentils, chickpeas, and grass peas, can be planted still before the frost-free date. They like cold weather, in fact. They'll grow better in cold weather, and they like wet conditions. The warm season legumes need conditions more like the tropics where they originate. The more it's like the tropics, generally the better they'll grow. And so they need to be planted in late May or early June here. Those would include common beans, soybeans, tepary beans, lima beans, and cowpeas. There are a few in-between things where I would say they should be planted a bit later than the cold hardy things, but can take a little more cold than the really warmth-loving legumes. Runner beans and adzuki beans would be good examples of in-between legumes. There's a second consideration, however, when you're thinking about your planting date. Don't follow the calendar too rigidly. Also keep an eye on the weather forecast. Because I tend not to water my dry legumes, I try to plant them just before it's going to rain, because I find that a rain just after planting tends to improve germination and help them to grow quickly and decrease the risk of seed rotting if the weather turns cold just after I've planted. There is a way to get around this dependence on the weather, and that is to soak your seed in advance. This is a particularly useful trick if you're growing something which is pushing your season length. And so I think it's worth considering, but not doing every time. To soak your seeds, you basically get them to germinate indoors instead of doing it outside. Put your seeds in a bowl, add several times more water by volume than of seeds, and leave it for maybe 8 hours overnight. Then the next morning, drain off the water. And for a day or two after that, you can just keep rinsing them 2 or 3 times a day. The more often you rinse them, the better. Just fill the bowl with water, drain it off again. The seeds will swell, and you may start to note their little radicle, the baby root, pushing against the inside of the seed coat inside the seed. You want to plant them just before the radicle emerges or just after. But this is the downside to this technique. While the germination gets the seed started, and it's more cold hardy once it starts growing, it's also more fragile. And so as the radicle begins to grow, you have to be very careful as you plant the seeds not to break it off, because if you break that radicle off, the plant will be stunted or the seed may even die. So this can lengthen your season, it can increase your germination rate, but it also means that as soon as you start soaking your seed, the clock is ticking on when you have to plant. You probably have 36 to 48 hours, maybe a little more, before the seed has to be in the ground after you start soaking. Another thing which may be worth considering, some people like to grow corn and beans together. This has a real advantage with some of the pole varieties of beans, because the corn acts as your bean pool, and so you don't need to build trellises. However, it does have a downside as well. The corn will tend to shade the beans and will decrease the yield of the beans, though the corn is not significantly impacted. So if you have lots of seed or don't care about getting too high a yield per square foot, this can be an advantage because it saves you time and trouble in building trellises. But if you're really worried about getting a high bean yield, this is not an ideal technique. It also requires thinking a bit more about timing. The corn needs a head start for it to be strong enough to hold up the bean plants as they grow up. And so you need to plant your corn first, wait until it comes up and is 3 to 6 inch tall plants, and then plant your beans. That means that the beans may end up being planted a bit later than you otherwise would if you were planting them with a trellis. And so you need to be careful not to choose a bean which has too long a season or it won't mature in time. Also, you need to think about comparing the size of your corn plant and the size of your bean plant. If you grow too vigorous a variety of beans on corn, it can actually pull the corn plants down and you'll lose the whole crop. And so you want to try and find a corn which is strong enough to hold up the particular variety of bean which you're growing. So I would recommend either choosing a bean variety which is specifically recommended for growing on corn, or aiming for varieties which are described in their catalog as being relatively short. 4 to 5 feet tall is a good idea. Once your seeds are in the ground and start coming up, there's relatively little tending to do with dry legumes. As I mentioned, I tend not to water my dry legumes unless we have a really serious drought. I do, however, mulch many of them with old hay. I do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, it retains more moisture in the soil, and so they do grow better. Also, the hay adds in more nutrients to the soil, and so it's one of my main ways of inputting nutrients and keeping the soil healthy. And another advantage is that it helps to decrease soil erosion if there's a lot of rainfall while the soil is still exposed earlier in the season. So often when my plants are relatively short still, I put mulch down in the aisles around the bed and also in the middle of the bed. However, I don't usually put it between individual plants because there isn't enough space to easily tuck the hay in there. You may want to think about mulching. There are other ways to do it as well, and many legumes don't require mulch. As you get farther into the summer, you need to start watching your legumes for maturity. What we're doing here is essentially letting the plants complete their full natural life cycle, and so you can watch them age gracefully. As they near maturity, they'll start to turn yellow and then brown and lose their leaves because the plant dies as it matures its seed. So you need to start watching as it turns yellow because you don't want the seeds to get too dry on the plant. You'll notice that the pods begin to turn yellow and then brown, and they'll go from being round and full of water to becoming leathery in texture and shrinking, becoming thinner, and then turning crispy dry at some point. And you need to decide somewhere in there that it's time to harvest. Deciding exactly when to harvest dry legumes can be a bit of a challenge. Ideally, for storage, a dry legume has to have seed which is so dry that when you press on it with a thumbnail you cannot make a dent in it. However, you often can't get them that dry in the field here simply because we have too frequent rains in the late summer and early fall when they need to be drying down. If you have legumes which have dried almost all the way in the garden and then they get rained on, the seeds will swell, just like they do when you soak them, and they will pop the pod open and shatter out of the pod and be lost on the ground. They may even sprout. If that happens, you can lose all or a part of your crop. So if rain is threatening and your legumes are near dry, I would recommend that you harvest them even if they aren't as dry as you would like, and then finish drying them under cover. Haul them inside and spread them out to dry indoors if you have enough space in an airy, relatively warm place. Or, if you need to, you can put them all on a tarp or sheet, haul them outside on sunny days, and haul them back under cover on rainy days. I've done that too. To return to the differences between bush and pool varieties here, this is where bush varieties can have both an advantage and a disadvantage. Because they're so near the ground, if they get a lot of rain just while they're drying down, they can be more prone to shattering and spoiling. However, they also tend to mature all of their pods together in a shorter window, And so if it's dry, then you can get your whole harvest. Because the bush varieties tend to mature in a relatively short window, some people will pull or cut the whole plants and haul them under cover to dry. However, with pull varieties, they won't mature that evenly. So for those, you basically have to hand pick individual pods. You'll notice they start to dry at the bottom of the plant and work their way up over time, and often the pods at the bottom can be quite dry while the pods at the top are still green, or the bean can even be flowering if it's a tall bean variety. So with those varieties, it's important that you keep an eye on where your driest pods are as you're harvesting, and harvest repeatedly. Often to get the highest quality seed, I harvest about every 2 days, particularly if there's rainy weather in the forecast. Particularly with heirloom varieties, you'll probably notice a wide range in how determinate or indeterminate they are and how long their harvest windows are. Generally, I like varieties with longer harvest windows simply because it decreases the risk that any one rainstorm will destroy a large portion of my crop. Once you've harvested your pods, it's time to thresh them out of their pods and get the seeds separated. There are a couple of ways to do this depending how many you have. If you have a relatively small quantity, I find by far the most satisfying way is to shell them out by hand. That way you get good clean seeds, you can sort out any that don't look so good easily, and you get to work hands-on with your legumes a lot, which is very satisfying. However, if you have larger quantities, or for some species like chickpeas, it can be a bit too much work to shell them out by hand. In that case, I would recommend treading them out. Spread a tarp or a sheet on the floor, or on the ground outside, and pile your pods or your plants on the tarp, then trample on them. Often we take 2 people and have them stand together and dance on the pods to knock all of the seeds out of them. Scrape your feet over them, stomp on them. If they're dry enough, they shouldn't be hurt by this. And once most of the seeds are out, you can lift off the fluffiest chaff pieces of plants and pods and throw those off of the tarp. Then dump all of your legumes into a pile of the middle and go on to the next step, which is winnowing. If you have more legumes than that is easy to do with, you may need to get some sort of threshing machine. We use a small bike-powered thresher which we built ourselves following plans which are available online. To winnow, you basically need to use wind to blow away everything that's lighter than your seeds. There are 2 ways to do this. You can use natural wind outside, or you can use a fan. I tend to use a container with a square edge because I find that it's easier to pour an even thickness of beans out of it so that the wind is able to blow away everything easily, compared to a round bucket where you tend to get a rounder column rather than a curtain of pouring seed. Pour it a couple of times to blow away everything lighter. If you did tread out your legumes, you need to be a little careful here because soil chunks tend to have about the same density as seeds, and so those will stay with the seeds. And if you don't want a crunchy experience when you're eating them, you'll need to sort those out by hand at some point. Once your seed is winnowed, you need to decide when it's ready to store. As I mentioned, the easiest test is how hard the seeds are. Take a couple of them randomly and press on them as hard as you can with a thumbnail. If they're dry enough, there will be no visible dent. The first couple of times I did this, I wondered if they would ever get that dry, or whether my hands were just too strong. I can tell you from experience that eventually, if you dry them properly, they will be dry enough, and they will get to a point where you cannot dent the seeds. At that point, you can store them in a paper sack or in a glass jar, and they'll keep for months or a year or 2. They're best eaten in the first year, however. If they aren't dry enough, they need to be dried further, spread on a cookie sheet or an old window screen, and stirred every once in a while so that they're able to finish drying down. If you store them before they're dry enough, they can mold. In our climate, it's also worth considering what to do if a frost catches late maturing legumes. Often, particularly with the warm season plants from the tropics, they don't realize that frost is coming, and so they'll keep producing more and more green pods right up until the day that a frost kills them. On that day, don't consider all of those seeds lost. Pods which have leathery pods but already thin-walled are often still able to mature into dry beans after a frost. Harvest them, bring them in, and dry them inside. Ones where the walls are still thick and filled with water when they freeze will probably be ruined for storage, but can still be eaten if the seeds still look good. Shell them out immediately for what we call Shelly Beans, which can be used basically the same as dry beans, except you don't need to soak them. You can either cook them right away, where they'll taste more or less like a dry bean except a little greener, or you can freeze them for later use. It's also worth considering saving seed for next year from your crop. The great thing about dry legumes, and also other staples like grains, is that the seed is the crop, and the crop is the seed. If you've produced good quality seed for eating, it may also be good for sowing, but there are a few considerations. First of all, you need to consider whether your variety will be pure next year so that you'll get the same crop again. To do this, you need to consider whether there are any other varieties too close, too nearby, with which it can have been cross-pollinated. Cross-pollination distances and rates vary for different legumes. Some of them are very self-pollinating, while some are very cross-pollinating. You can find good information on how to isolate them and produce good quality seed in Seeds of Diversity's book, How to Save Your Own Seeds. Generally, I would say that most legumes are selfers, but different species have different rates of crossing. So that with some of them, like common beans, peas, and chickpeas, you need very small isolation distances to maintain pure varieties, while others like runner beans or favas need very large distances to ensure proper purity. While your plants are growing, it's also helpful to keep an eye on them. Walk past your patch frequently and watch for any plants which are different from their neighbors. If you notice a plant which is drastically different, look closely. If it's diseased or has obvious excessive insect damage, you probably want to remove it. However, if it's just different in some way, different pod color, different growth habit, different leaf shape or color in some way, you may want to look more closely. If you like the variety you already have, you probably want to tear it out right away so that its seeds don't accidentally get mixed in with its neighbors and it doesn't have a chance to cross-pollinate them. However, many heirloom varieties are the result of gardeners who decided to keep those fluke plants in their rows. So you may want to consider whether this plant is in some way superior to its neighbors. If it is, you may wish to save its seed separately and try growing it out on its own. Often it takes a few years to stabilize a new variety, but it's not that difficult. If you're new to cooking dry legumes, it's helpful to know about soaking. Many dry legumes need to be soaked before they can be cooked. They imbibe water, which makes them cook more evenly and also makes them more nutritious. Ideally, you let them soak for a while. I like to put them to soak last thing before bed, and then drain them the next morning and cook them for lunch or supper. However, there are also techniques to soak them quickly. Usually you put them with water, bring them to a boil for a minute or two, and then let them sit for an hour before you actually cook them. When you cook them, it's important to think about how long they'll take to cook. If you're used to store-bought dry legumes, you'll find that homegrown ones cook much, much quicker. And so you need to watch them carefully the first couple of times until you're used to that, or you'll end up with mush. And that's an overview to start growing dry legumes in the garden. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you found it more interesting than my cat has. If you want to find more information about yields, techniques, and particular varieties, you can find it on my website, carrickseeds.ca. Thanks for watching.